All right, so let's talk about how we're actually going to create this project. As when we're creating any art project, the best way to get started is to plan. And you'll remember Joseph Forgety did a great job planning his artworks to make his prints as beautiful and well executed as they could be. So I've got this planning paper for us, sketching and planning page. I'm going to put my name right here, as should you. And then you'll notice we have 3 different rectangles for planning our prints. I have them oriented vertically right now, but if you wanted a horizontal print, you can absolutely turn your paper and design that way as well. So I'm going to come up with 3 different ideas, and then I'm going to choose the best one to use for my printing plate. So with my different ideas, I want to be thinking about how I'm going to be using Unity in my designs intentionally. Maybe one of the ideas I have is I want to create some kind of flower, and I could use Unity by creating repeating shapes. So maybe I'll begin by drawing the inside of the flower with the little parts of the flower that have the pollen on them. And I want to remember, I want to make my lines not too small and detailed, because if they're too detailed, they'll run together when we trace it onto the foam. So to make sure they're not too detailed, before we actually draw our image on the foam, we're going to be tracing with Sharpie. So even though I'm starting with pencil, I want to be thinking about the width of a line that a Sharpie marker makes. Remember, Sharpies make a nice wide line. So I want to make sure I'm not having too much small detail close together. So maybe I like sort of that number of these little curvy lines to represent where the pollen is in the flower. And maybe next, I'm going to draw a repeated shape of a sort of curvy triangle to represent the petals of my flower. And I can even make my lines run to the edge of my paper, so it looks like I'm filling the whole space. Remember that filling the whole space is another way to show unity. And I could even stack these shapes so it looks like it's continuing. So you can see I've got some lines that are sort of representing a flower. Maybe I want to think about what I'm going to do in this negative space. I want to fill it. So I'm creating unity. And maybe I'll create unity by making some long, pointy leaves. And I'm repeating this same shape over and over again. You'll notice that I finished filling in this design with some lines to really fill the space. And so I've got these repeating lines, and these shapes are sort of similar. It goes from curvy to an open triangle to a closed triangle to a line. So there's also relationships between the shapes that create unity in this first idea. So I've added 2 other ideas. So here I've got a very abstracted beach scene where I've got some waves that the closer ones are much bigger. And as they go further and further away, they get smaller. And the same thing with these clouds. The clouds very far away in the distance appear to be quite small, but as the clouds are closer and closer, they appear bigger. So we've got this variation from big to small, from the top of the picture to the bottom of the picture, and altogether that creates unity. And again, in this very abstracted sort of campfire scene where I've got these shapes for the fire and then these swirls to represent the smoke, I got unity because I've filled the whole space with the repeating shapes. I haven't neglected or left empty any part of my picture. Now what I need to do is decide which is my favorite design and why. And how does that design use unity or harmony? So maybe if one of your designs doesn't show unity as much, think about choosing a design that shows unity a little more. I think for me, I would say that my favorite design, I'm not sure yet. What I want to do is I want to trace them with the Sharpie marker, and then I can make sure they're really going to work when we get to drawing them on the foam. Because remember, we want our lines to be not too close together, thick enough so that when we press them into the foam, we'll be able to, they'll show up and we can see clearly what they are. So let's trace and then choose our favorite. When I'm tracing, I'm literally just going over my lines with the Sharpie marker right on top. And this will help me see if my lines are too close together. Let's say that I had two lines that were just like this. If I trace them both with the Sharpie marker, as you can see, they're touching at the bottom. So that means they were too close together. All right, so I've gone ahead and I've traced all three designs with my Sharpie marker, and then I've put the lid on tight so it won't dry out and we can keep our markers nice. And then I've realized in the process of tracing that my favorite design is this one with the clouds and the waves. And it's my favorite because I'm so excited about trying out different color combinations when we're printing it. Remember, printing is the process of making more than one copy. So once I draw my design on here, I'll be able to print it more than once. So I can try out different color combinations, and I'll show you how to do that next. It'll be really fun. And this design uses unity because of the repeating lines. So I've got this similarity here in these waves, and because of how both the clouds and the waves transition from big to small to show that depth and to show the space that this horizon line is very far away. So all of that together is working to create unity. I've also filled the whole space and we don't have any empty parts. So now that I've chosen my favorite, I'm ready to create it on my piece of styrofoam. So what you can do is, usually it works best, I find, to just redraw it. Sometimes you can try to trace it, but that's not as precise since this is paper that's not tracing paper. So it's hard to really transfer the image fully. And sometimes it can be hard to line it up really precisely. If you're super careful, sometimes you can line it up and trace it, but I find it's usually better to just redraw it the best that we can. So I'm going to hold down my image and I can look at what I drew the first time. And I'm going to begin to create exactly what I drew the first time on my styrofoam. So when I'm drawing on it, it is creating a little line. And eventually we're going to have to make these lines deeper by tracing them with the pen. So I'm going to go ahead and create my image, and then I'll show you how to deepen these lines to create our printing plate. So I've got my image drawn with pencil, and you can see the slight divot that it started to create if you look carefully on an angle, but it's really hard to still see our image. And right now, if we tried to print this, the lines wouldn't be deep enough to create that image for us. So what we need to do is we need to use a pen. I've got this ballpoint pen here, and I'm going to go over all of my lines twice so that they're really going to show up when we create it. So the nice thing about going over it with the pen is now we can actually see our image. So it does take a little bit of patience to create our image very carefully. And if it's a little different from your design stage to actually creating it on the foam, that's okay. You'll notice here I had 4 complete waves, and this time my waves ended up shifting a little bit. So they're a little bit different, and that's okay. It's okay for things to change throughout our design process. In fact, that can be part of the design process itself. So I'm going to go over all of my lines and trace them with the pen once. And then I'm going to go in with a different colored pen. This pen is a sort of a bluish color, and this pen is sort of a black color. And I'm going to trace them all again to make sure they're nice and deep and they'll work really well for when we make our print. Right, I've got my first round traced, and now I'm going to go over everything a second time, because remember, we want our lines to be really deep so that our print will come out very nice and visible. If it's possible to use a second color of ink to do this, it makes it easy to see which lines you have or haven't traced for the second time. But if you need to use the same pen over again, that's okay too. Just be sure to pay extra close attention to what you're tracing. Oopsie. And the other thing I wanted to mention, be careful about what your hand is doing as you're holding this. If you have long fingernails like I do, make sure you don't dig it in, because that'll create a line in your print. So I'm just gently using the pad of my fingers to hold it down as I'm working. It is sort of a small space, but you can accomplish a lot in a small space with patience and working carefully. So I'll finish up the waves and the clouds here, and then we'll talk about how to print. All right, I finished going over my lines a second time. And if we hold this on its side, you can really see how the pen has carved into the foam, just like how if this were a traditional woodblock print, we would use special tools to carve into the wood to create our design. Now we're ready to add our ink, which we're going to do with marker. I'm going to put a spare piece of paper down so I don't put any marker color on the table as I begin to ink my plate by coloring it. And then I'll show you how we can transfer that ink to our paper to print it. Now, I want to be thinking about unity with our print still, even with the colors. So maybe to emphasize that, I'm going to choose an analogous color scheme. So colors that would naturally go together in the color wheel. So blue and purple, we know, are next to each other in the color wheel or in the rainbow. Gray and black are both neutral colors, so I might use them as well. So let's think about how I can begin to color my image. And if you have more colors, you could experiment even more. Maybe I'm going to choose some purple for this first wave. Your colors don't have to be realistic either. They can be pretty imaginative. So you can see, obviously, we don't have purple waves in real life, but I can make my art however I want. So I did purple for this first wave and the second wave. You want to make sure you're really going all the way to the edges. So that's why it's nice to have this paper underneath to make sure I can go all the way to the edges. And if a little bit went on the table, it'll go on my paper instead of on the table. I'm going to continue coloring the rest of the plate here with the colors that I've chosen, or maybe in a few other colors, and then I'll show you how to print. We've got the whole printing plate colored all the way up to the very edges, so it's time for my most favorite part. I'm going to slide this out of the way, and I've got a whole piece of printer paper here. You can also use drawing paper, and the key to making this print work is a slightly damp sponge. You can see my sponge isn't dripping, but if I touch it, it does feel cold and wet. So I'm going to take the sponge onto the paper where I want to create the print, and I'm going to gently swipe maybe just a couple of times. We don't want the paper to be soaking wet, but we do want it to receive the print. And you can see the paper starting to buckle as it absorbs the water. So I know this paper is ready for the print. I'm going to take my piece of styrofoam, line it up over that area where I just got it wet. And I want to carefully make sure once I put it down, it doesn't slide around. And then I want to use the squishiest part of my hand, which for me is right here. And I'm going to gently press slowly and carefully. We don't want to hit it. We don't need to use aggression. I'm just kind of sliding my hand all over. And you can use your fingers too if using the bottom of your hand feels hard. If you have a lot of printmaking supplies, you can even use a brayer, which is something that looks like a roller to apply even pressure. But if we don't have that, we can use our hands. So I've applied pressure, I've smoothed it all over, and I can even see how the ink is starting to transfer there. And if I pick it up, I have a beautiful print, and it's absorbed almost all of the ink. So I could go and I could make another print with different colors. Look at how the lines in the print where we pressed down their lines, because those were pressed away from the surface, they didn't receive any of the marker ink. And now they show up in our print as white lines, which is really similar to our artist's style. He's got a lot of white lines in his artwork too, Joseph Forgety. So now I can let this dry. This water paper wasn't ever very wet, so the water will evaporate quickly. And if I wanted to display my print, here I've got an example that I finished where I cut out the sketch, just like we started out by sketching our ideas. So here I would cut out this sketch of my water and clouds. And I've also got my printing plate and my final print. So in this example, you can see my sketch, my printing plate, and a final print. So you can see the whole process, and I've just glued it to some construction paper and decorated the border. So those would be some extra steps you could do if you wanted to, or you can enjoy your beautiful print that you made and think about what you learned about unity and the artwork of Joseph Forgety. It's been so fun making art with you. I hope you enjoyed this project.